The air began to hum, a low, bone-vibrating thrum, swiftly joined by the whispers of a wind that sounded like it had swept through ancient skeletal forests. Then, from the periphery of hearing, drifted faint, discordant piano notes, a melody both familiar and profoundly wrong, twisting in on itself. In the polished surface of an antique mirror, a cozy living room reflected back, until for a split second, a distorted, elongated shadow whipped across the glass, vanishing before it could be fully grasped. The normal reflection instantly returned, leaving behind a persistent chill. A deep, resonant voice cut through the fading hum, calm yet carrying an underlying tremor of apprehension. They say reality is what we perceive. But what if perception itself is a lie? What if the fabric of our world is woven by unseen hands, and the shadows we dismiss are merely the edges of their loom? Across the world, the subtle unraveling began. In a bustling town square, people pointed and shouted at Agnes, a beloved elder known for her kindness, suddenly convinced she was a thief. Agnes herself stood bewildered, clutching her shawl, while the eyes of those who adored her now held only cold accusation. On a blustery coast, endless rain lashed a small fishing village, the sky a perpetual, desaturated gray. Villagers huddled under makeshift shelters, their faces etched with despair as a child wept, and fishing boats, usually a source of comfort, thrashed violently in the turbulent water. The wind howled with a mournful sound. In an ancient temple, the serene face of a revered, centuries-old stone statue of a benevolent deity subtly, unnervingly, morphed into a malicious, toothy sneer. Yet no one reacted, seemingly perceiving it as its normal, revered state. Hushed, uncertain voices began to overlap. A young woman in a coffee shop whispered, "The shadows are watching. I just feel it." An old man tending his garden muttered, "The air feels thin, doesn't it? Like something's about to tear." A frantic businessman pacing his office, his voice strained, cried, "My own thoughts betray me. I can't trust what I remember." A collective unease settled, a pervasive, unspoken fear that had begun to seep into everything. In a dimly lit room filled with books and artifacts, Elara Vance, a frail but sharp-eyed local historian, sifted through dusty tomes, her brow furrowed in troubled thought. The Shadow Weavers. A name barely remembered, she muttered to herself. Just forgotten tales, really, or so they say. As she spoke, behind her, a seemingly solid wooden bookshelf subtly shimmered and warped for a fleeting moment, as if the wood itself was rippling like water. Elara didn't notice, lost in her thoughts as the chilling, discordant piano notes from the beginning returned, swelling slightly before abruptly cutting off. The day had started like any other in the quaint town of Oakhaven. Children's laughter echoed through the streets as they chased each other between the pastel-hued houses. Birds sang merrily, and the sun shone with a warmth that promised a splendid day. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, a disquieting discord was beginning to stir, a dissonance felt but not understood. Elara Vance, a woman whose life was interwoven with the history of Oakhaven, sat in her attic sanctuary surrounded by books and relics of the past. She was poring over an ancient text when a peculiar sensation washed over her. It wasn't anything she could put her finger on, more of a feeling than a tangible occurrence. The silence of her attic suddenly seemed to amplify, the ticking of the clock on the mantel a deafening metronome. Glancing up from her book, she saw nothing out of the ordinary. Yet that feeling persisted, a premonition of something amiss. As if summoned by her thoughts, a gust of wind rattled the window panes, though the sky was clear and the wind was silent outside. Startled by the sudden draft, Elara went to close the window when her gaze fell upon an intricate silver pendant nestled in the crook of the pane. It was a design she recognized from the old book, depicting a stylized tree with deep roots and branches reaching towards the heavens. The pendant seemed to pulse with an inner light, drawing her in. Intrigued, Elara reached for it, and as her fingers brushed against the cool metal, the pendant flared brightly, bathing the room in an ethereal glow. Then, just as quickly, it dimmed, leaving Alara blinking in the sudden darkness as the wind outside picked up, swirling fallen leaves into miniature tornadoes that danced across the pavement. In the town square, Agnes Peabody, a woman whose age was as uncertain as the tides, was making her daily rounds. Her worn shoes pattered on the cobblestones as she walked, her eyes twinkling with life despite the wrinkles etched on her face by time. All at once, the sky darkened as if someone had pressed a shutter over the sun. Agnes, startled, looked up just as a heavy raindrop splashed onto her outstretched hand. Soon, the soft pitter-patter grew into a drumming crescendo, and Oakhaven found itself in the midst of a torrential downpour. People scurried for cover, pulling their cloaks tight against the wind. But amidst the storm, something strange was happening. The rain seemed to have an unnatural pull on people, urging them towards the town square where Agnes stood rooted in place. Some resisted the call, while others succumbed, drawn to Agnes as if by an invisible force. Meanwhile, at the edge of the town, the weathered face of Old Man Hemlock, who tended his herb garden with gnarled hands, contorted in surprise. He clutched a trowel, his gaze fixed on the rain-lashed sky. "By the lore of ages," he muttered, "this is no natural storm." Inside the dimly lit study, Alaric Vance ran a trembling hand through his thinning hair. His wife's absence, coupled with the inexplicable happenings in town, had frayed his already fragile composure. His gaze fell on the pendant lying on the table, pulsing faintly, and he felt a surge of determination. He had to understand what it meant, not only for his wife, but for the safety of everyone in Oakhaven. With renewed purpose, he slipped the pendant around his neck and stepped out into the raging storm. As night fell and the rain showed no signs of abating, Oakhaven was plunged into darkness, both literal and figurative. The storm had knocked out the town's power supply, and a palpable fear had taken root in the hearts of its residents. Huddled in their homes, listening to the wind's mournful howl and the relentless drumming of the rain. No one knew what to make of the events unfolding, and the silence between the claps of thunder was filled with whispers of unease. Then, as if orchestrated by some unseen hand, the rain ceased as abruptly as it had begun, replaced by an eerie silence that was even more unsettling than the storm itself. People cautiously opened their doors, stepping out into the rain-washed streets. And that's when they saw the river. It was no longer the placid, meandering stream they had always known. It had transformed into a churning, frothing torrent that was several feet higher than its banks. The normally quaint wooden bridge over the river now seemed like a fragile thing in the face of the roaring water. As the townsfolk stood mesmerized by the sudden and dramatic change, a sense of foreboding settled over them. They had seen the river behave erratically during storms before, but never like this. Never had it been this angry, this wild, and it was clear to them now that this was no ordinary storm. Their quiet, predictable lives were being upended by forces they couldn't comprehend, and the river was just the beginning. And there, standing on the bank, was Alara, her face pale, her eyes wide with a dawning realization. She reached out a hand as if to touch the raging river, her fingertips tingling with an electric charge. As the chorus of confused voices rose in the square, she turned, her eyes shining with newfound clarity. She raised her voice to be heard above the din. "We must stop the Weaver's touch." Her words hung in the air, stark against the backdrop of the raging river. The townsfolk, still reeling from the spectacle before them, looked at her in confusion. The Weaver's touch? What did she mean? Who was the Weaver? Their questions hung unanswered, lost in the turmoil of the moment. For now, the river was their most immediate concern. Its waters continued to rise, threatening to spill over its banks and engulf the town. And, as the night wore on, the danger only seemed to grow. The tranquility of Oakhaven had been shattered, and they knew that their lives would never be the same again. The very foundations of their reality seemed to be shaking, and they could only hope that they would emerge from the storm unscathed. But as the moon climbed higher in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the town, they realized that this was just the beginning. The true test of their resilience, their courage, and their faith in each other was yet to come. The storm had passed, but the tempest within their world was just beginning.